Hello, and welcome back to Friday Vinyl Club, where every day feels like a Friday and every album tells a story. I'm Jamie, and each episode I invite a guest to bring along one special record, an album that didn't just play in their life, but shaped it. This isn't about chart positions or critical reviews, it's about personal soundtracks, the records that stay with us long after the needle lifts. This episode, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Iain McDermott, music lover, pop historian, and the voice behind the brilliant Back to Now podcast, a long running celebration of the wonderfully eclectic world of pop compilations. Also known as Pop Rambler, Ian describes himself as a fan of music and pop culture, who's also dabbled in writing, radio, and theatre. And if you've heard his podcast, you'll know that that mix of passion, humour, and craft runs right through it. We'll talk about the podcast a little later, but first, Ian's Friday Vinyl Club pick is New Gold Dream 81, 82, 83, 84 by Simple Minds. Released in September 1982, it marked a turning point for the band and brought them their first wave of mainstream attention with hits like Promised You a Miracle. But before we dive into the album and Ian's connection to it, let's rewind a little. Ian, welcome to the Friday Vinyl Club. How are you feeling today?
I'm good, thank you. It's great to be here, Jamie. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time. I really, really appreciate it. I like to always start really just opening up around early memories. Where do you start? What's your early music memory?
It's probably my parents. Like so many of us, those early influences came from my mum and dad growing up in the west of Scotland, as we did. There was always music in the house. And at that time, it would have been commercial radio, which would have been the big stations like Radio Clyde, I suppose, but also Radio 1, which was still in medium wave back in the day. So, radio was a big thing, but there was always albums in the house as well. My dad had a wonderful big kind of music centre that I think he paid up with HP over many months. So that was always on, and there was records, there was cassettes. My dad was very proud of his hi-fi speakers up on the wall, which I think was a bit of a status symbol. But yeah, I mean, there was just so much music. My dad, both my parents had grown up in the 60s, so there was that broad influence. So my dad was into things like the Searchers and the Kinks and a lot of those kind of beat groups. I think he was a bit of a passive aggressive mod in the day, certainly from the photographs we've got in the house. So there would have been a lot of that kind of thing. The Moody Blues, I seem to remember. My mum, on the other hand, was a bit more eclectic. There was a lot of country, Patsy Cline and Jim Reeves, but also some of the kind of big kind of singer-songwriter types as well. And ABBA. ABBA was a big thing in our house. I always remember the ABBA albums coming in at Christmas time. So yeah, there was always music playing, and I've got great memories of house parties and probably not a great care getting taken for vinyl, if I remember rightly, which maybe kind of stuck with me later on. But yeah, there was always that kind of fondness, and even in the car, the radio would always go on. And it's probably something I've passed on myself as well.
ABBA seemed to span so many generations and families, didn't it? What was that appeal?
I think it was many things. I mean, the songs are so accessible, starting from the earliest ones all the way through, regardless of the kind of genres that ABBA skipped across, whether it be rock or disco or, almost kind of into new wave by the time they got to the Visitors. The songwriting was always something that resonated. And my youngest daughter now is a huge ABBA fan, and she's a teenager. She's kind of grown up through the Mamma Mia culture, and I know that's how she learned about all these songs. But I think it's the melodies. I mean, I genuinely think that, and I think the clever songwriting, that playoff between Bjorn and Benny. I think it just resonates, and you can see it throughout the decades afterwards. And I think that's why it crosses the generations.
We were really fortunate to get tickets for the ABBA Voyage when it opened down in London. Have you managed to see that show?
I have, yeah. I must admit, I managed to engineer a whole summer holiday around it. Yeah, well, the year the tickets came out, I kind of basically just jumped straight into every Ticketmaster queue I could to get them. So we were there the first summer. It's just incredible. It's hard to describe because it's easy to to say, oh, well, it's just holograms or whatever, but it's not. I mean, I don't know what you felt, but I thought it was just quite an experience.
Yeah, I mean, I was skeptical going into it. Well, I mean, we were incredibly excited, but actually experiencing it and seeing them appear on stage in front of you
Mm.
was mind. It was just mind blowing. Sorry, I've taken you down a tangent there. Would you say your dad's music was the more dominant force in the house?
I don't actually think it was. I think it was probably more my mum, to be honest, because my mum also controlled the radio, which meant that there would be the kind of oldies stations would be playing, or growing up in the 70s was back to the 50s and 60s, But I think mum probably held that a bit more. But I've got very fond memories of some of my dad's vinyl. And I've managed to keep a hold of it. So one of his kind of albums that always stuck with me was the Changes Bowie album, the Changes One Bowie, which I've still got his copy of it as well, and it just looked and sounded like nothing else. Even amongst all the kind of beat groups and 60s stuff that was there, this just sounded like nothing else. So there was that kind of balance, I suppose, between the music. But yeah, I think my mum probably had the upper hand.
Did you go rummaging through the collection then? Were you allowed to go through? I know that there was a point in time where personally I wasn't allowed to touch my dad's record collection.
I think latterly, yeah. I think they were quite interested to kind of develop that love of music for myself and my sister. My sister's younger than me, and I think there wasn't anything too sacred, but I think in some ways that helped to develop a kind of healthy culture of looking after vinyl because we got to access it quite early on. I mean, I was saying early on, we were probably 10 or so before we really got to play them, but I can still remember them hovering over me as we put the needle on the record and making sure everything went on fine. So, which I now do with my daughters as well. So, he's just passed it on to me, obviously.
Oh, brilliant. Do you remember the first sort of vinyl record that was yours that either you purchased yourself, maybe pocket money, and you went out and bought?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Very, very fondly. My first 7-inch single, which I think I got for my 8th birthday. So I'm aging myself here. You'll be able to work this out, listeners. Was "The Tide Is High" by Blondie. And I can still see the cover. It was a kind of snapshot off the Auto American album. Kind of zoom in on Debbie Harry. So that was my first 7-inch single. I'd have to break rank and say my first album was actually on cassette. It was Char Hates 81, and it was the following year, and it was one of those K-Tel albums, see compilations, nice and early. But it was one of those buy one get one free type things. So you got volume 1, you got volume 2 free. And I remember very vividly getting into Woolworths and having this in the brown paper bag and taking it home, and it was just great to have these songs. I think very early on, as well as those artist albums my parents had, there was always a kind of healthy collection of compilations as well. I think
Okay.
I think they like getting a bargain, Jamie, to be honest. So they got more songs. So, yeah, so Charheads 81 was my first one. K-Tel, I can still see the blue and red covers. And yeah, that was 1981. So I had Ultravox Vienna was on there, and Human League, Open Your Heart, and you can see my new wave pop stuff coming out quite early on here. But yeah, that was that. But first vinyl album, I'm actually thinking what that could have been. Because I think I was a cassette household growing up, because it was easier in your bedroom. You had your ghetto blaster and you had your cassettes, and it was so I didn't get my first record player until I was 15. So I can very clearly tell you what my first vinyl album was then, and it was Now That's What I Call Music Volume 6. That was Christmas 85. So yeah, there's always been variously compiled pop running through the house.
It's not something that you've grown into an affection for the sort of music compilations. It seems that they've walked side by side you throughout your life.
Yeah, I mean, again, that kind of comes from those early influences in the house. I think we had those 70s compilations, those Ronco and K-Tel albums, and 20 number ones and 20 Blazing Bullets and 20 something else's. There was all of them. I think they always looked incredibly vibrant as well. They always looked very attractive, and you'd have different pictures of the artists. So I think even long before I began collecting my own now albums, it was probably running through the veins.
Did you start to form an affinity for any particular band early on and start falling into a crowd? Or were you always kind of hovering above the masses?
I think probably the first band that I really got into was through one of my best mates at school, John, who now actually makes the music for the podcast, which is nice. I've known John for well over 40 years or so. He got me into Ultravox. He had this cassette of the Vienna album, and I remember going over to his house and listening to it on one of those tiny wee tape players that you would have, the not even a ghetto blaster, just the tiny wee kind of tape players with one speaker and the buttons on the top. And I think, up to that point, when you've only known the radio and pop music, to hear the beginning of the Vienna album, and that kind of instrumental sound and electronic sound, that just blew me away. And I think from then that kind of picked up a big interest for me in electronic pop. And it was a good time to be into electronic pop in the early 80s because there was a lot of it about. But Ultravox was probably one of my first bands. I think the next band that I really got into would have been the Pet Shop Boys. And again, that kind of coincided with my first record player and picking up the West End Girls single and kept it going from there. But there's been bands. I mean, as you then grow into music and you discover things like the Beatles and David Bowie and these kind of big hitters, they've kind of formulated a big part of kind of my listening as well. And then latterly bands like Crowded House, the kind of singer-songwriter, World Party, all sorts of things like that. They kind of build up the picture a bit as well. But yeah, still fly a flag for Ultravox.
So were you finding bands of the day as you were growing up and then start to go back towards the Beatles and the big sort of hitters? Or were you picking those up while you were listening to your dad's record collection at the same time?
No, I think it was later on. I mean, the Beatles were always kind of there. They were always omnipresent, and I've kind of told people before that actually my introduction to the Beatles was Stars on 45. Which sounds almost heinous now when you say that. Stars on 45, for anybody who's too young to remember, was basically a Dutch studio group who made medley hits of various bands. And they did one of the Beatles. And that was where I first heard songs by the Beatles. But I didn't really properly get into the Beatles until I think it was when the CDs were first reissued in 1987. And there was a huge, big market drive push on the Beatles coming back out. And then you started picking them up. And once you start diving into the Beatles and the albums, and you kind of get beyond the big hits, it's just a treasure trove, So I think it happened later. And then once you start that journey, I think for me, public libraries were a massive gateway for vinyl and discovery, because in the 80s growing up, I just couldn't afford to buy albums, Again, you would have piles of blank cassettes and a library card. Home taping was killing music, basically. That was how, and you would often pick up albums just by looking at the cover and thinking, well, that looks interesting, I'll give that a go. And you would piece things together. That's how I discovered Pink Floyd as a kind of late teen, and starting at Dark Side of the Moon because it just looked incredible. It's quite hard to describe something now, but walking back from the library with a copy of Atom Heart Mother under your arm with a cow staring out. I mean, it does invite looks from people. It does invite other types of attention if you learn to run quite quickly. But that was how you discover albums, and some worked and some didn't. But that was how I also discovered that I really liked 60s soul music. You would find albums by Otis Redding and the Four Tops, or again some of those Motown chartbuster compilations, just anything you could get your hands on. And kind of start to go backwards. And, unlike the world now where you can just pick it all up online, you had to really go and discover these things or hear a song on the radio and then wait 2 weeks to hear it again. and then try and go and find it somewhere. So, but that was part of the fun.
So your music taste is now quite varied, isn't it? I mean, you've pulled out so many different names there, so many different genres of music. Uh, One you've just pulled out there, Crowded House. We both share a deep love for Neil Finn and his
Mm,
music. They're one of the artists and band that I've seen the most live over the
mm.
years. I was wondering, at what point did you start getting out of the house and into live music venues? Can you remember stepping out and your first live gigs?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, yeah, very vividly. My first proper gig was Deacon Blue, and it was Christmas 1989. It involved the big important bus ride from the small town I lived in Renfrewshire into Glasgow to the exhibition centre. And yeah, that would have been the World Knows Your Name tour in 1989. And yeah, that was just incredible. Still have a great fondness for Deacon Blue. So that would have been 89. I would have been about 17. The following year, I went to college, but I moved out into Glasgow, which was just amazing. But that kind of first of all, it was clubbing. I suppose I was kind of discovering dance music and doing some DJing. So having those nightclubs in the early 90s in and around Glasgow was incredible. But then I picked up gigs again probably 91 and onwards. I remember my second ever gig was it was Wonder Stuff actually, the Wonder
Okay.
Stuff at the Barrowlands in Glasgow. And I mean, if you want some '90s references, they were supported by Kingmaker and Cud. So
Yeah.
as indie as you could possibly get. But yeah, I mean, after that, I saw Elvis Costello live, incredible. So yeah, the kind of early '90s, we were we were blessed with a lot of great venues and great gigs.
Glasgow's got an amazing music scene, hasn't it? I've recently been up to the Barrowlands to see Delamitri
Yeah.
play. Um, I find Glasgow an incredible city anyway. There's just a vibe in Glasgow that I think it's quite unique. How
Mm.
would you describe the music scene up there?
Oh, it's always been so important. I mean, even prior to me even knowing what that Glasgow scene was, you were aware watching Top of the Pops of bands like Altered Images and Aztec Camera and those kind of early 80s influences. You're always aware of Scottish bands being on the television, but by the time I got to particularly college, there'd been that vibrant kind of late 80s scene. So you'd seen, as I say, bands like Deacon Blue, Hue and Cry, Delamitri, other bands that often didn't get the big break, like the Silencers and Goodbye Mr. Mackenzie. I mean, it was just, whether they were Glasgow based or in and around that kind of central belt of Scotland, it was just incredibly vibrant. And by the time I got to college in 1990, any night of the week, you could see a band like, say, Teenage Fan Club or the Pastels. There was so much. I was too young to really appreciate the postcard record scene in the early 80s, which is now obviously revered, and the music's incredible. So for me, it was almost that kind of second and third wave coming through
Yeah.
into the kind of late 80s and early 90s. But yeah, you're right about the atmosphere in Glasgow. I think the closest I've felt it being like is Manchester. I think that there's something about that affinity to music, but also that willingness to kind of really be proud of its roots. I think as well. I remember a book by is it Grant McPhee, who's a wonderful Scots filmmaker and writer, and he wrote a book about that kind of late '70s, early '80s punk scene between Postcard Records and Fast Records, Fast Products, which was the Edinburgh-based indie label. But Grant talks about how, in fact, I think a lot of authors have mentioned it, that Glasgow was kind of taking its influence from America. So you were getting that soul influence, and that's what gave that kind of jangly pop type sound of Aztec Camera and those early postcard albums. Whereas Edinburgh was often looking to Europe. So you were getting that kind of hard, slightly more industrial sound, which for a country that's only 40 miles wide is, is quite interesting. Scotland's always soaked up influence from all over, and then it kind of creates something quite unique in what it sounds like.
You touched on Postcard Records. Now, I only know about Postcard Records because Justin Curry of Delamitri references Postcard Records in various interviews. Can you give us a little bit more background of what that Postcard Record scene was?
Yeah, I mean, it's as I say, I was probably too young to kind of fully appreciate it, but it's more or less starting from about 1980. It was a man called Alan Horn who set up what we'd now call an independent record label to really just release records by friends and local Glasgow bands. But it was incredibly homemade culture. The tagline was "The Sound of Young Scotland," and it's from that where bands like Orange Juice and Aztec Camera and a band called Joseph K came from. Very very short lived label. I mean the 7-inch singles that they released are now incredibly rare to get a hold of, but it became a kind of launch pad for a lot of that kind of Glasgow sound that came next, really. We talk about Delamitri, for example. I know Justin references Postcard a lot. It was that kind of DIY ethic, but trying to look at the glamorous side. It was indie, but it was very aspirational, if that makes sense.
Right.
It looked to the sound of Motown, it looked to the sound of America, and tried to create that. The sound of Young Scotland was Alan Horn's vision of trying to be Berry Gordy, more or less. But it's very, very fondly remembered, very, very short lived. I mean, I think there was only I don't know exactly how many singles, but not very many. Kind of 20 or so singles. There'll be listeners screaming at me now saying exactly how many there were. There's been some wonderful retrospective documentaries and books around Postcard Records. But it's like so many things, it kind of becomes a launch pad for what comes next, but very inspirational.
Okay. Thanks for that. So back to that sort of live scene, you've seen quite a few notable acts. Did you see Simple Minds when you were out and about in Glasgow?
Yeah, I did. I've managed to see Simple Minds on a number of occasions in quite different venues. And I'm going to name drop here, so forgive me. I saw them in a club called King Tut's Wah Wah Hut. Now I'd love to say I saw them very early on, but it wasn't. It was much later. It was into the 2000s. But anybody would know that King Tut's Wah Wah Hut was where Alan McGee discovered Oasis. So I saw them early noughties, I think it was, doing a gig in there, which was quite incredible. I've bounced on the sprung floor in the Barrowlands to Simple Minds as well, which was quite incredible. And then a couple of years ago, I saw them just in front of Edinburgh Castle in Princes Street Gardens. They did an open air show and played the whole of a very fond album of mine in its complete form as the sunset, which was quite incredible. So yeah, I've been fortunate to see Simple Minds on a good number of occasions.
As far as Simple Minds is concerned, I've only ever seen them once. I went down to Birmingham a couple of years ago to see Delamitri support them down at the big arena down there, and I was absolutely blown away by the showmanship of Jim Kerr on absolutely fine form. But I think that brings us quite neatly onto the record you've brought into Friday Vinyl Club today, the New Gold Dream. So for full transparency, I guess I'm a part-time Simple Minds fan. I know the big hits. I think Josh Widdicombe pointed out on your Back to Now podcast for 1992 that Alive and Kicking was chosen as the anthem for Sky TV for Premier League football. So we know you've seen Simple Minds. When did their music first come onto your soundscape? I assume that was before you started to see them live at gigs.
Yeah. Oh yeah, it was. It was. Again, I've certainly got memories of seeing Simple Minds doing Promise You a Miracle on Top of the Pops. I would have been about 10, probably. Watching Top of the Pops when I was 10 was quite tricky because it clashed with Cub Scouts on a Thursday night. but my dad had bought a video recorder, so it was great. So we could record Top of the Pops, which meant I could always watch it back. And I very fondly remember Simple Minds then, not really knowing who they were. They were just one of those new romantic type, 80s bands as kind of part of things. But it certainly chimed. But it was probably later on. It probably was round about, you mentioned Alive and Kicking. It was probably around about 85 when I started to become aware of Simple Minds. So I'd be about 12, 13. And Don't You Forget About Me was such a big hit that summer, and then followed up by Alive and Kicking, the single, and then the Once Upon a Time album. And I think at school, I very fondly remember the Once Upon a Time album doing the rounds round the school, to be copied onto blank cassettes. And I think that's when I first became aware of them. But this album, New Gold Dream, I didn't know at the time. I didn't come to that till later on, and it was probably even after Once Upon a Time, and then I think they did a live album, Live in the City of Light. So I knew songs like Glittering Prize and Promise You a Miracle, but I didn't know the album. And then a friend of mine had it and played it. I think it was his brothers or somebody else in the house. And I remember sitting probably a very rainy day in the house, and he played this album from start to finish, and it absolutely blew my mind. And from that point, it's an album that's stayed with me ever since.
Where do you think it sits in the Simple Minds story?
It's interesting. I think I'm right. Simple Minds released 4 albums before this. This was their 5th studio album. I think it'd been a compilation of early singles when they jumped from Arista Records to Virgin. I don't know about you, but I don't think there's many bands nowadays would get 4 albums without any major chart success, without being dropped, basically. No. And the fact that obviously the record, the kind of whole music industry was different back in those days. For me, it's very much a linchpin album because this was Simple Minds' big breakthrough. It gave them their first big kind of top 20 hits in those singles, but it also got them noticed. And it was very much a kind of coming together of everything that Simple Minds had done up to that point. They'd been quite electronic. They'd started off quite punky, and then they kind of moved into that electronic sound, and still trying to find their kind of way. And the album directly before this, an album called Suns and Fascination, introduced tracks like Love Song and The American, and you could see it coming through, big European sound. But New Gold Dream's got a sound all of its own. I mean, it's to me, it's almost undefinable where it comes from. There's a warmth. To me, it doesn't sit in the same place as say Ultravox or kind of Kraftwerk or anything like that. The influences for me are more Roxy Music or Duran Duran. There's that sound, but there's a kind of Japan sound, but there's a Celtic element to it. It's just a real coming together, but it's definitely a linchpin album in Simple Minds' canon.
Mm. When you heard it first, when your friend played it through for you, what was it that grabbed you about it? Was it the production? Was it the synth you just mentioned there, or is it Jim Kerr's vocals, the lyrics? What pulled you into it?
I think it's at the risk of sounding like a muso, right? There's a production sound to it which is incredible. It was produced by a guy called Peter Walsh, who had produced previously Heaven 17 the year before, but there's just a kind of warmth sound that brings you in. Jim Kerr's lyrics are very, very hard to describe and define. I think it works very well, but it's almost a kind of like a soundscape to the music in some ways. The lyrics, they're quite mysterious. They're quite kind of difficult to define. It was definitely the sound of the album. The synths play a big part. Michael McNeil, who was the keyboard player of Simple Minds at this time, had a wonderful kind of texture to his sounds. So there was a very warmth in the synths. Derek Forbes, the bass player, there's just fantastic bass runs. You just hear a confidence in the band, and there's definitely a shift in the songwriting from songs that had gone before. There'd only been glimpses of it before. But I think as well, if you look at the album cover and the design of the album cover, it kind of draws you in. There's a kind of mystical element to it. It's not a religious album or anything like that, but there's kind of overtones of kind of faith and discovery in there. And even if you compare it, if you compare the album cover to those around it at the same time in 1982, it doesn't look like the other albums, which is interesting because there's a man called Malcolm Garrett that designed it, who'd also designed the Rio album cover, amongst others, for
Mm,
Duran Duran. So
yeah.
but it doesn't look like that. It almost sits. And I think sometimes some of the best albums throughout musical history are the ones that don't look or sound like they've come from a certain time. And for me, New Gold Dream, whilst there's obviously that kind of synth sound in it, it's almost timeless in the way it sounds. And I think that's something that's probably what grabbed me when I heard it. So I'd heard this at the end of the 80s when there'd have been a lot of big pop and lots of all sorts of various things going on. And this almost sounded like a kind of break from that. It just sounded different.
I was going to ask you about the cover, and I think you've covered that there absolutely perfectly. Minimalist, I thought, but regal with gold palette. It's called New Gold Dream, but then in brackets 81, 82, 83, 84. What's the background to the numbering on that? Do you know?
Well, I've read various books and kind of different theories around that, and Jim Kerr has given clues to it. I always think of it as a kind of looking back, looking forward. I mean, the actual track itself, New Gold Dream, is fabulous. I mean, it's almost kind of electro disco, in the way it kind of drives forward. It's almost like kind of Donna Summer track, Giorgio Moroder style. And I think in some ways it's that kind of glance back from 81 into, well, what's coming next. I also think as well, you know, you mentioned Jim Kerr earlier. Jim Kerr is one of these incredible showmen. And if you see Simple Minds do this song live, it's a real air puncher,
Yeah.
this song. And I think sometimes Jim Kerr, I think in similar ways that Bono often does, it's more about kind of lyrics as another instrument, if that makes sense. It's like another melody line. And I think sometimes Jim Kerr does that, but I don't really know the background to the numbers, and I think in some ways I'm glad I don't, because it keeps a
Keeps
wee
a
bit
little
of that.
bit. Right.
Yeah, it does. It kind of keeps that kind of mysticism in there. But it's certainly at this point, Simple Minds were a band that were very much breaking out from that early bit of the 80s. Um, the sound would change quite dramatically. They never made another album like this, which
Mm,
again is, I think, part of the appeal. You know, the next album, Sparkle in the Rain, was very much grabbing hold post war by U2. It was very much Simple Minds aiming at the stadium sound. It was
right.
produced by Steve Lillywhite. It had tracks like Waterfront on it. You know, it's a fantastic Simple Minds sound, but it's a different one. Whereas New Gold Dream has real space to breathe, and it's a you know it. There's bits of it that are very, very quiet. There's instrumental tracks on it. You know, there's a song called "Somebody Up There Likes You," you know, which is instrumental. You know, there's a track on the second side called "Hunt on the Hunted" that has a Herbie Hancock keyboard solo. It's like, you know, now the next album from this on was much more bombastic and stadium filling, and then they go on to tracks like "Alive and Kicking," and Simple Minds' evolution changes. So, and I think that for me is part of the appeal of this album, that it kind of almost just sits like a kind of oasis between two Simple Minds. You know, that very early European electronic sounding one that wasn't as accessible to many people, but produced an incredible range of tracks, to then this next one up and the kind of Simple Minds that I suppose more people know.
Are there any tracks on here that when you first listened to it, you were really pulled towards, but now maybe feel differently to, or vice versa? Have any grown on you over the years?
Well, funnily enough, and I think a lot of people say this about albums that they really love over years, the singles for me are the weaker tracks on this album.
Really?
Yeah, and I think that's just because I've found other things in other tracks. As I say, my favorite track on this album is called "Hunt on the Hunted," which is quite a kind of dark track, but it has an incredible bass line from Derek Forbes and this Herbie Hancock keyboard solo in the middle of it, which is just it's a kind of, you know how some songs evoke certain times of the day. It's a late night song. It's a contemplative song. Now, Promise You a Miracle is a fantastic track, but you'll hear it a lot on the radio. Glittering Prize is a great track. I'm going to be controversial, and I think the opening track isn't great on this album. Someone Somewhere in Summertime. I don't know. It kind of, there's much better tracks on the album, but they were the songs, I suppose, that initially draw you in. It's only once you start then to really get to, to know an album, you find more depth in other tracks. And certainly on this album, the album title track is just incredible. Why that was never a single, I don't know, because I think that would have been an amazing single. To me, it sits alongside something like Party Fears 2 by The Associates, or, something along those lines in that 1982 place. But yeah, no, Hunt on the Hunted is a real particular favourite alongside the title track.
In terms of redefining a band and actually influencing an entire pop landscape, do you think an album today could have that same impact?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, there's been so much, I suppose, over the years that that different bands have tried to do, this type of thing.
Yeah, you're probably right. And there are bands maybe going forward that have had a big impact. But I was just thinking around when I've done my research, the way that it's described of how this particular album landed. Simple Minds fans and critics were enjoying Simple Minds music before this album, but they never expected a band to deliver an album of this quality and of this game-changing magnitude.
Do you know, as you're talking there, an album that comes to mind in a kind of similar way, an album that lands from nowhere and confounds people's expectations, fans and critics. It reminds me of Screamadelica by Primal Scream.
Okay.
Which I remember having kind of, again, I was at that kind of college early kind of stage of, kind of branching out. We knew Primal Scream as a kind of lo-fi indie band who were scraping the bottom end of the kind of indie chart on the chart show every week. And then suddenly Andrew Weatherall grabbed hold of them, and this album appeared out of nowhere, and it was just like, this shouldn't work. It was just incredible. And I think what you describe about New Gold Dream was the same. There's a wonderful book actually that I'd recommend to listeners called Theme for Great Cities, which is a biography by Graham Thompson that came out a few years ago, that really takes through the story from Simple Minds as a kind of early punk band all the way through to global superstars. And I think, Graham talks about that and has quite a lot of interviews with the band in there about that kind of, almost that kind of lightning in a bottle moment of everything coming together. And Simple Minds could have continued being that kind of second division electronic, band, they may have kind of sparked, but there was something about that coming together that created this album. And it was maybe just the right time for everything. It probably was the fact that, that kind of new romantic sound had also started to embed. The technology had changed. The studio technology was also better. I mean, a lot of this album was recorded at the Townhouse in London and Rockfield in Wales. So there was real legacy studios, no doubt helped. And I think what you also had was a band beginning to hit their stride, a band that knew each other's musical capabilities. And I think that came through. There's, I talked about Michael McNeil, the keyboard player, and Derek Forbes. You've also got Charlie Burchill, that doesn't often get a lot of credit as a guitarist. When people do charts and lists of famous guitarists, Charlie Burchill goes under the radar, but he has an incredible way of weaving melody in and out of songs with guitars and effects. And Jim Kerr, I mean, they're just a wonderful come together of that kind of musicality on the album.
For anyone discovering Simple Minds today, would you recommend they start with New Gold Dream, or would you point them somewhere else, or are you doing them a mixtape compilation?
That's an interesting one. Because there's so many different variations of Simple Minds. I mean, I don't know if you landed in the middle of Belfast, child, what would you think Simple Minds were? I don't know. If you landed in the middle of I Travel from 1980. Um, I don't know. I don't know if I would recommend this as the first album to listen to. Um, no, I would actually. I am. I'm going to say yes. Listen to New Gold Dream first, because I would always suggest starting at the beginning of a band's chronology, but the first four albums in Simple Minds' career is an evolution, shall we say? And you might lose interest early on. I suppose that's the wonder of where we are now in kind of musical history. You can dip kind of dip back and forward and pick what you want to listen to. But I'd love to find out what somebody who didn't know Simple Minds thought of New Gold Dream.
Hmm.
What they could hear, because again, where does the influence come from? There's all sorts in there. So, but yeah, start with New Gold Dream. I don't know where to go next, to be honest.
I gotta say, do you work backwards or do you work forwards?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. Usually, I find Jamie when I find not a new band, but when I find a band I maybe haven't known, I tend to kind of go in quite deep. Um, so I don't know. I'd avoid a mixtape. I mean, I know I love a compilation album, but I'd avoid a mixtape because I don't know if that tells the real story. And I think if you were just to pick the big hits from this album, that's only a snapshot of what the kind of richness and depth that the album brings. So, yeah, no compilation for Simple Minds here.
Well, linking to Now Music compilations, if my research is correct, and I'm not putting you on the spot here, Promise You a Miracle was on Now Yearbook 1982, and Simple Minds have had 16 unique songs over 25 Now compilations. Does that sound about right?
It does, and it sounds more right now because what you've just described there was something called the Now Yearbook 1982. Over the last couple of years, the Now team have really diversified into a lot of different types of genres and albums, and they've been doing yearbooks and all sorts of kind of theme genre albums. Because I think prior to that, for those listeners that are old enough to remember when Now albums just came out 3 times a year and they had a number on them, which they still do. Up to that point, Simple Minds didn't have as many entries. They probably did have a few, but not as many since the yearbooks have had a chance to revisit them as well. But no, those numbers sound right, Jamie.
All right. Well, let's talk about Back to Now, the podcast. And for anyone who hasn't encountered it yet, yes, it's about now that's what I call music compilations, but it's also about much, much more. These albums have become time capsules of how the decades were lived. Your love of pop history really comes through on Back to Now. I'm curious, how did that podcast start? Was it a fully formed idea or was it just one of those, I'll try these moments?
A bit of both. Thank you very much for the kind words, by the way. I really appreciate that because it is much more than just Now albums. It is much more about pop culture. So the idea came about, first of all, almost about 10 years ago now. In the very early days of a social media platform called Twitter when it used to be quite nice. And I was chatting to various people, and one of them was a guy called Pete Selby, who is now very much in charge of a wonderful book imprint called New Modern Books. And at the time, Pete was working in various elements of the kind of music industry. And you know that way when you just can tell when people were sharing pictures and images and various things about pop music, you think this is someone who's on the same wavelength as me. So we kind of shared various posts and messages and stuff just around pop music. And then we both happened to be in London a couple of years later, and we arranged to meet up for a drink. And I remember saying to Pete, I said, "Do you think anybody's ever done a podcast about Now albums? Because somebody must have done that. It must be out there." And he just looked at me and was like, "No." But he says, "But it's a brilliant idea." And basically from that point there, that was 2018. I kind of started just to sketch the idea, but never really fully got around to it till COVID hit. And then, like everybody else, we were at home and there wasn't much happening. And I contacted Pete and I said, remember we said, and he said, yeah. I said, do you want to give it a go? And he said, yeah. And so basically, we just did a pilot episode. We just tried it. And if I remember rightly, the technology was dreadful. I think we lost the connection about 3 or 4 times. I came out of the back end of it with bits of audio that sat for about 6 months. And then I pieced it together into an episode. And it was very homemade. I mean, I didn't think it would ever take off. I always thought it was incredibly niche. But by the end of 2020, I had managed to interview Bob Stanley from St. Etienne, which is completely random. And I mean, a lot of it just came through happy accidents and connections and linking up. But what I think it tapped into was what I'd always hoped it would, which was just more than pop music. And it was more about how pop music at any given time, you indicated it there, tells a story of what's going on in people's lives. And it just so happened that these Now That's What I Call Music albums, for me, were important kind of almost time signatures of kind of, bits of my past and other people's as well. And it's just been able to bring people onto the show and invite them, I suppose, just to tell me their story through music, and make those connections, and what songs worked and what songs didn't, and what songs were missing, and how some songs triggered other memories of what was going on in lives and stuff like that. It's been a real privilege to do, and we've somehow managed to stumble on for 6 years, which is great. But yeah, it was, as I say, something that, a happy accident that just kept going.
When did you personally first realize that these albums were these time capsules and cultural snapshots rather than just music compilations? When did that light bulb moment happen?
Probably quite late on, if I'm being honest. And probably, I mean, I started rebuying them on vinyl. Again, because I was a cassette purchaser, as most kids were in the 80s, I had a lot of these albums on cassette, which then became almost, unplayable, I suppose. And I bought a few on CD, but it was probably the early noughties when I started rebuying them on vinyl, because at that point you could buy vinyl quite cheaply online. And nobody wanted mid-80s compilation albums because there wasn't a kind of currency for them. So it was probably then, and going back and revisiting them and picking up an album like Now 5 in 2004, so like 20 years old, and looking at tracks like The Word Girl by Scritti Politti, or Walls Come Tumbling Down, or The Unforgettable Fire by U2, or whatever it might have been, and looking at them from a bit of distance. Because I think if you look at the recent now releases, so we're up to now 122 at the moment. Because people say to me, do they still make them? And you go, yes, they're still there. But you look back at those, you don't see where the big hits are, if that makes sense. Or, well, not so much the big hits. You don't see the songs that are going to last yet.
Okay.
And I don't think you see those songs for, I don't know how long, 5 years, 10 years. You need to look back at the albums from, say, 2010 now, which is scarily 16 years ago, and think, right, what is it that still lasts? And I think you need that distance. You can predict some of the songs, but we get it wrong a lot of the times. The songs that we think are going to land and land well disappear over time. So I think it was probably for me those kind of early noughties, when there was a bit of distance to look back at that kind of 80s culture, 90s culture.
Okay. You've had some amazing guests on the podcast. Are there any episodes or guests that really, really resonated and stayed with you?
Yeah. I think what's been great is that everybody that's come to the episode has come with a story. So there's always something interesting. I've never dictated which albums people pick. I always ask them to pick albums. And I think, so that means that people always bring memories and stories. But some of the ones that have really resonated with me, or I've really enjoyed, and that's not to say, I mean, I've enjoyed all of them for different reasons. But some of those journalists and writers that were involved in pop at various times, I'm thinking of writers like Jude Rogers, for example, Sean Pattenden, writers who wrote for smash hits. So I was buying these magazines at the time and reading these articles, been able to hear them talk about the artists that were on these albums, how they met them, and what that was like. I mean, I'm thinking back, Sean Pattenden, who'd been a smash hits writer in 1989, talking about the Rebel MC's dental habits, for example, or being stuck in a lift with living in a box. I mean, these are stories that are just, they're completely timeless. But people like that, Pete Paphides was just such a wonderful guest as well. Pete brings such a depth and knowledge as a writer and as a music fan as well. They've been incredibly good as well, and then the fortune last year to have not just a fantastic writer from record collector Darrell Easley, but to have him and Nick Hayward at the same time. But just, been able to have a, in inverted commas, genuine pop star talk about working with Jeff Emerick at Abbey Road. And trying not to pinch yourself to say, is this actually happening? Or hope that the Wi-Fi signal doesn't drop. But yeah, just that ability, but equally, kind of other episodes where maybe the guests haven't been as kind of named to a big audience, but bring such incredibly resonating stories about pop and how it changed their lives. It's just such a privilege.
I'm glad you mentioned Pete Paphides there. I listened to that episode back a couple of weeks ago. He's a huge figure from a Crowded House, Neil Finn perspective. Just
Yep.
going back to that,
Yep.
obviously he's heading up Needle Mythology, and they released the first Finn Brothers record on vinyl a couple of years ago. We were really, really excited about that. And I'm manifesting here, but one day I want to get Pete Paphides on the Friday Vinyl Club and have a chat with him. What's next for you and for Back to Now podcast? What's coming up? What have you got in store? Have you got anybody on your dream guest list?
Oh, dream guest list. Yeah, I mean, there's a few. If only just to kind of pick away at their pop culture knowledge. I'd love to have an interview with Neil Tennant. Neil Tennant has probably been omnipresent in my kind of pop life since I was about 13, and I, it's I know that the Pet Shop Boys are revered, but I don't genuinely think they're revered as much as they should be for what they bring to pop music. So I would love, and I think he's just such an interesting guy. I would love to have a pop blether with Neil. I think that would be quite impressive. So I would say watch this space, Jamie. There'll be more to come this year.
Cool. Do you get, just a quick one, do you get starstruck? I mean, if Neil Tennant's been sort of walking with you since you were 13, if you had him on a podcast, would you get starstruck, or are you at that point now where you can look past that?
No, and I don't think I'd want to get to that point where I wasn't starstruck. And I think chatting to Nick Hayward was quite interesting because, again, Nick Hayward is such a recognisable figure in British pop music. And Nick Hayward talked about exactly that, still being starstruck, and also still being a pop fan. He doesn't see himself as somebody that's above us all. As far as he's concerned, he's got his icons, and I think he said that in the episode, how he still sees himself as a pop fan. I think that's important to hold on to. I still get starstruck, absolutely. So no, I think if I got to a stage where I saw somebody waiting in the waiting room to come in online and I wasn't starstruck, then that might be the time to pack up, I think. No, and as I said earlier, I just still feel incredibly grateful that people give up their time to want to come and chat about pop music. So, and regardless of where the guest sits in the kind of line of fame, it's just always a privilege to be able to have those conversations.
Yeah, I mean, I saw you interview one of my musical heroes, Justin Curry, in Manchester at that Louder Than Words book festival, and you were so composed. You conducted that interview superbly, and I tried to put myself in your position and tried to think to myself, could I interview Justin Curry from Delamitri? And right, I'm not sure I would be able to do it. Not just yet. Maybe I need a few more practice runs. Um, Iain, we always close with a Friday spin, a recommendation. Have you got anything that you could give our listeners? What's dominating your headphones or speakers right now? Could be old, new, rediscovered. Is there anything at all you want to pass on?
Well, yes, there is. And I don't want listeners to think that I am constantly promoting now. That's what I call music. However, um, I was saying earlier how the series has really diversified over the last couple of years, and there's now all sorts of really interesting deep dive genres into 12 inches and alternative and indie and dance and all sorts of things. But one of the things that they've done over the last couple of years is a series called The Vaults. And what they've done is they're almost kind of side albums to the yearbooks, but incredibly deep dive, fascinatingly curated albums. And the most recent one called the Now Yearbook Vault 82. And seeing as we were talking about Simple Minds, I've been absolutely immersed in this album recently. Basically, what it is a real deep dive. Lots of names you would know, but lots of songs that you maybe don't know. I didn't think, as someone that's bought Now albums for the last 40 years of his life, that they would actually be able to introduce something that completely spun me off my axis. And this has. And there won't be stuff on here for everybody, but it's almost like looking at a year through the looking glass. It's like it's a completely different view. So I would thoroughly recommend any of the Now yearbooks. You can get them on CDs as well, but they do look wonderful on vinyl, and it's coloured vinyl as well. And they're just, if you're interested in music and you want to know more about, maybe genres or areas that aren't explored very often, there's nothing on this album you will hear on daytime radio. And that's a good thing, I would suggest, because there's lots to rediscover. So yes, that would be my pick, Jamie, would be the Now Yearbook Vault 82.
Iain, thank you so much for joining us on Friday Vinyl Club. Did you enjoy that?
It has been wonderful. It's also very nice to not be asking the questions and just being left to ramble. So thank you very much, Jamie.
It's been wonderful diving into the world of Simple Minds and exploring the brilliant cultural rabbit holes of Back to Now. To our listeners, you can find links to Iain's podcast in the show notes. If you haven't already, give Back to Now a listen. It's one of the smartest and warmest journeys through pop culture out there. We'll also add some of the tracks discussed today to the Friday Vinyl Club Spotify playlist. You can reach us anytime on Instagram at JamieB1973 or email the Friday Vinyl Club at hotmail.com. If you've enjoyed the episode, please share it, follow the show, or leave a rating. It really helps us grow and more people to find us. Until next time, this has been the Friday Vinyl Club. Keep your records spinning and your stories alive. Thank you so much, Iain. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Jamie. It's been wonderful.